Charleston, South Carolina, August 1853. A plantation owner named Cornelius Whitmore paid $400 for a girl who couldn't speak. She stood on the auction block, eyes downcast, throat scarred, silent as stone. For 6 months, she never made a sound, until the night she opened her mouth in the candlelit study and screamed a name that shattered everything. How does a mute girl scream? And why did that single word make a respected gentleman flee into the swamp and never return? What happened on Whitmore Plantation wasn't just cruelty. It was something far more calculated, more personal, and so deeply twisted that when the truth finally surfaced, an entire community chose denial over justice. Some secrets don't just destroy individuals. They expose the rot in the foundations we build our societies upon. Before we continue, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you want access to exclusive uncensored videos about the world's most brutal crimes, consider becoming a member. And don't forget to hit the like button. I want you to picture this: the South Carolina Low Country in the early 1850s, where Spanish moss hangs from live oaks like funeral shrouds and the air itself feels thick enough to choke on. The humidity wraps around you like a wet blanket, carrying the scent of magnolia blossoms mixed with something darker, the smell of rice fields flooded with brackish water, of human sweat, of an economy built entirely on bodies. Charleston was America's wealthiest city per capita. Its cobblestone streets, lined with pastel-colored mansions that faced away from the street, turned inward toward secret gardens where the truly ugly business of slavery could be conducted behind wrought iron gates and thick palmetto hedges. The rice plantations surrounding the city were death traps. Malaria killed 1 in 3 enslaved workers within 5 years. The labor was so brutal, so unrelenting, that plantation owners calculated human life purely in terms of profit margins and replacement costs. But here's what your history textbook won't tell you. These plantations weren't just agricultural operations. They were laboratories of control, places where human beings were systematically broken down, rebuilt, and transformed into something barely recognizable as human. The isolation was complete. The nearest neighbor might be 10 miles away through impassable swamp. What happened behind those hedges, within those property lines, was absolute law. And Cornelius Whitmore understood this better than most. Cornelius Whitmore was exactly the kind of man you'd trust with your daughter, your money, your secrets. 42 years old in 1853, he cut an impressive figure, tall, well-groomed, with steel-gray hair and the bearing of old Southern aristocracy. He'd inherited Ashwood Plantation from his father, 800 acres of prime rice-growing land worked by 93 enslaved people. He attended First Presbyterian Church every Sunday without fail, sitting in the same pew his grandfather had purchased in 1789. He served on the Charleston Library Society board. He wrote occasional letters to the Charleston Mercury about agricultural innovation and tariff policy, always signing them with elaborate courtesy. Now, you have to understand, men like Whitmore were considered the best of their class. He didn't beat his slaves publicly. He didn't separate families at auction unless absolutely necessary for financial reasons. As he wrote in his meticulously kept ledgers, he hired a doctor to visit the slave quarters quarterly, which was more than most planters bothered with. His neighbors considered him humane, progressive even. But here's the thing about monsters. They rarely look like monsters. They look like pillars of the community. They look like your neighbor, your uncle, your pastor, and Whitmore had a particular interest that he discussed with no one, an obsession that had been growing for years, fed by isolation and absolute power. He was fascinated by silence, by control, by the question of what happens when you strip away someone's ability to tell their own story. Whitmore's public reputation was built on a carefully constructed narrative of benevolent paternalism. He called his enslaved workers "my people," with what sounded like genuine affection. He'd tell visitors to Ashwood about his modern approach to plantation management, how he provided adequate rations, allowed small garden plots, even permitted limited movement on Sundays for religious services. "A well-fed, healthy Negro is a productive Negro," he'd say, as if this pragmatic cruelty was kindness. When he purchased the girl at auction, a girl the auctioneer called only Lot 17, approximately 16 years, mute, scarring on throat and back, recently acquired from the estate of deceased planter Marcus Hammond, Whitmore had a ready explanation. He told his overseer, a man named Dalton Pierce, that he'd bought her as a charitable act because no other bidder wanted a slave who couldn't follow verbal instructions. "She can work in the house," he said. "She can learn through demonstration. It's the Christian thing to do." The other planters nodded approvingly. This was exactly the kind of refined sensibility they expected from Whitmore. See, that's how these systems worked. Cruelty wrapped in the language of mercy. Exploitation disguised as salvation. The girl, who would later be identified as Celia, was led away to Ashwood in chains, and the Charleston gentlemen moved on to their next purchase, never questioning why a man would pay premium price for damaged goods. Let's be real. Ashwood Plantation was designed for secrets. The main house sat at the end of a mile-long avenue of oaks, completely invisible from the main road. Between the house and the slave quarters stood a dense cypress swamp that most people wouldn't dare cross even in daylight. Water moccasins, alligators, sinkholes that could swallow a man whole. This natural barrier meant the enslaved population was effectively imprisoned without walls. But Whitmore had created something else, something most visitors never saw. A separate building he called the hospital, located on the far eastern edge of the property, accessible only by a narrow causeway through the swamp. He'd built it himself in 1848, telling his overseer it was for quarantining sick slaves to prevent disease spread. It made perfect sense. Malaria and cholera swept through slave quarters regularly. Isolation was medically sound, except the hospital had features that made no medical sense. The windows were barred from the outside, the doors locked from the exterior. Inside, there were restraints bolted to the walls, which Whitmore explained as necessary for delirious fever patients. There was a desk covered with journals and notes written in Whitmore's precise handwriting. There was equipment that looked almost medical but wasn't quite right. Leather masks, metal tools, containers of various chemical compounds, and there was one room, the farthest from the entrance, that stayed locked even when the building was empty. Even Pierce, the overseer, had never been inside it. When slaves from Ashwood occasionally appeared at Sunday services with unusual injuries, damaged vocal cords, scarring around the throat, a strange vacant quality in their eyes, there were always explanations. Tetanus from a rusty nail, fever-induced delirium that required restraint, attempted suicide by hanging that was thankfully interrupted in time, agricultural accidents. The brutality of slavery normalized every form of violence, made every injury explainable, every trauma dismissible. The local doctor, Edmund Fairchild, had been visiting Ashwood for 15 years. He'd never seen anything that troubled him enough to question Whitmore's methods. Mr. Whitmore runs a tight operation, he'd tell anyone who asked. Losses to disease are actually below average for rice plantations. Whatever he's doing in terms of medical care, it's working. When Fairchild encountered slaves who seemed unusually traumatized or withdrawn, he diagnosed Negro melancholy, a supposed condition that white doctors claimed was common among enslaved people who were ungrateful for their circumstances. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because these weren't just individual failures of morality. This was a system designed to make atrocity invisible. Every institution reinforced the lie. The churches that preached slaves' obedience to masters, the courts that didn't recognize black testimony, the medical establishment that created pseudoscientific justifications for torture, the newspapers that portrayed plantation life as bucolic and harmonious. Whitmore didn't operate despite his community. He operated with their full structural support, whether they knew the details or not. Dalton Pierce, the overseer, knew more than he ever admitted. 38 years old, scarred from smallpox, Pierce had worked at Ashwood for 9 years. He wasn't educated like Whitmore, but he was observant. He noticed things, like how certain slaves would be summoned to the hospital and return days later changed, not physically broken in the obvious ways, but psychologically shattered, moving through their work like ghosts, refusing to speak even when speech was demanded of them. Pierce never asked questions because asking questions jeopardized his position, his salary, his future prospects. He had a wife and 3 children living in the overseer's cottage. He'd come from poor white trash origins and clawed his way to relative respectability. His job was to manage the labor, maintain productivity, and ignore everything that wasn't explicitly his business. When Whitmore took certain slaves to the hospital in the middle of the night, Pierce recorded it in the work log as medical treatment and moved on. But Pierce did one thing that would later prove crucial. He kept detailed personal notes separate from the official plantation records. Not out of conscience, out of self-preservation. He wanted documentation that whatever was happening at Ashwood was Whitmore's doing, not his. These notes, hidden in a tin box beneath the floorboards of his cottage, recorded dates, names, and observations. Cryptic entries like June 12, 1851, Hannah Hospital. Return June 19th. Won't eat, won't speak. Master says fever. Now you have to understand who Celia was before Ashwood. She'd been born on the Hammond Plantation, 60 miles inland, the daughter of a woman named Ruth who worked in the main house. Celia grew up with the advantage, if you can call it that, of proximity to the slave owner's family. She learned to read a little, which was illegal. She learned to sew exceptionally well. She had a voice described by other enslaved people as beautiful, clear, the kind that led hymns on Sunday. Then, when she was 14, something happened. The records are deliberately vague, but Marcus Hammond's Plantation journal from October 1851 notes, disturbance in the house. Celia damaged, sent to Fields. 2 months later, another entry. Celia's throat injury severe. Cannot speak. Reduced value significantly. When Hammond died in June 1853, his estate sold off its human property, and Celia ended up on that Charleston auction block, marked down because her muteness made her difficult to manage. But here's what the official records don't tell you. Celia's muteness wasn't from disease or accident. Other enslaved people who'd been on Hammond's plantation whispered a different story, that she'd witnessed something, started to scream about it, and someone had crushed her larynx to silence her. She'd survived, but her voice was gone, until it wasn't. Enter Samuel Brooks, and this is where everything begins to crack open. Brooks was a 23-year-old clerk from Boston, sent south by his employer, a textile firm, to establish contracts directly with plantation owners, cutting out middlemen. He arrived in Charleston in February 1854, full of that naive northern certainty that he understood how the world worked. He'd read Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, felt appropriately horrified, and considered himself morally superior to the slaveholding South. Then he met it face to face and realized he understood nothing. Whitmore invited Brooks to Ashwood as a courtesy. Potential business partners were always entertained lavishly. Brooks arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, expecting a quick tour and contract negotiation. Instead, Whitmore insisted he stay several days. You can't understand our agricultural excellence without seeing the full operation. Mr. Brooks, be my guest. That first night, Brooks was given a guest room in the main house, 3rd floor, overlooking the back grounds. He couldn't sleep. The heat was oppressive, and through his window came sounds he couldn't identify. Not quite animal, not quite human. Around midnight, he saw lantern light moving across the grounds toward the swamp. He watched Whitmore, dressed in plain work clothes, leading someone, he couldn't tell who, along the causeway toward that isolated building. The way Whitmore moved, quick and purposeful, suggested this was routine, familiar, something he'd done many times before. Brooks mentioned what he'd seen the next morning at breakfast, casually, trying to sound unconcerned. I noticed you were up late, Mr. Whitmore. Is everything all right? Whitmore smiled easily. Dedicated care of one's property requires dedication at all hours, I'm afraid. One of the field hands had a fever spike. I took him to the hospital for observation. The explanation was smooth, practiced, reasonable. Brooks felt foolish for even mentioning it, but over the next 2 days, Brooks noticed more. He saw the slaves in the main house moving with a kind of hypervigilance he couldn't quite name, like animals in the presence of a predator. He noticed how they avoided eye contact with Whitmore, how they seemed to stop breathing when he entered a room. He saw Celia working silently in the kitchen and was struck by the raw scar tissue around her throat. When he tried to speak kindly to her, she recoiled so violently she knocked over a water pitcher. Don't mind her, Whitmore said, appearing suddenly at Brooks's shoulder. She's damaged, mute, simple-minded, I'm afraid. I took her as an act of charity. But there was something in Whitmore's eyes when he looked at Celia, something that made Brooks's skin crawl. Not anger, not disgust, something almost tender, almost possessive. The way a scientist might look at a successful experiment. Let's be real. There had been inquiries before. In 1851, a Methodist minister visiting Charleston had heard rumors about Ashwood from enslaved people hired out to work in the city. He'd written a careful letter to the local sheriff expressing concern about the spiritual welfare of Whitmore's slaves. The sheriff, a man named Thomas Rutledge, who'd known Whitmore since childhood, had ridden out to Ashwood for a courtesy visit. Whitmore had given him a tour, showed him the tidy slave quarters, the adequately stocked rations, the hospital with its clean floors and medical supplies. Some malicious gossip from troublemakers, I'm afraid, Whitmore explained. I run a Christian household, Tom. You know that. Rutledge had written back to the minister, investigated claims, found no evidence of mistreatment. Mr. Whitmore operates a model plantation. This is how systems protect themselves. The sheriff wasn't corrupt. He genuinely believed he'd conducted a thorough investigation. But he'd looked only where Whitmore directed him, asked only questions that had prepared answers, seen only what was meant to be visible. He'd never demanded access to that locked room in the hospital. never interviewed the slaves privately, away from their master, never questioned why several names had disappeared from plantation records over the years with only the notation "deceased" and no burial records. The system didn't need active conspiracy. It only needed people to believe what was comfortable to believe. On his third day at Ashwood, Brooks encountered Jacob, a man of about 30 who worked in the plantation's carpentry shop. Jacob had been at Ashwood for 7 years, and unlike the other slaves, he was allowed limited conversation with visitors. Whitmore showcased him as an example of proper Negro education and advancement. Jacob could read numbers, do basic mathematics, create detailed woodwork that Whitmore sold at profit. But when Brooks complimented his skill, Jacob's response was strange. He said, "Thank you, sir," in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere very far away. His eyes didn't focus quite right. His hands trembled constantly. When a tool fell and clattered against the floor, Jacob's entire body seized with such violent terror that he collapsed. Later, Brooks learned that Jacob had been treated for fever in the hospital 2 years prior. Whatever had happened to him there had left him functional, but fundamentally altered. Other slaves whispered that before the hospital, Jacob had been rebellious, outspoken, a natural leader. After, he was docile, obedient, and prone to episodes of what we might now recognize as severe PTSD. I want you to picture this, a man whose personality has been systematically erased, who goes through the motions of life like a puppet whose strings are controlled by trauma. This wasn't discipline. This was deliberate psychological destruction. And Jacob was walking proof of something monstrous happening at Ashwood. What Whitmore was doing had a name, though no one would use it publicly for decades: experimental trauma conditioning. He was attempting to isolate the mechanisms by which human will could be broken and rebuilt. His journals, discovered later, reveal a mind that saw enslaved people not as human beings, but as subjects for hypothesis testing. He wrote about threshold points of psychological collapse, about the relationship between physical pain and voice, suppression, about reconstructing behavioral patterns through controlled fear application. He'd been influenced by writings from European physicians, studying mental illness, from theories about phrenology and racial hierarchy, from his own observations of how slavery already broke people. But Whitmore wanted to perfect the process. He wanted to create slaves who were incapable of rebellion, not because they were physically restrained, but because their capacity for resistance had been surgically removed from their psyches. The scarring on Celia's throat, not from disease. Whitmore had damaged her larynx deliberately as part of an experiment in forced silence. His journals ask, can trauma-induced muteness be reversed under extreme stress? Will the subject attempt communication even when physiologically unable? He was testing her, pushing her, waiting to see if he could find the breaking point where her body would override the damage he'd inflicted, where survival instinct would force sound through ruined tissue. He treated human beings like laboratory animals, and for years he'd gotten away with it. Samuel Brooks wasn't a hero by training or temperament. He was a clerk who liked orderly ledgers and predictable days. He had no experience with danger, no particular bravery, no reason to risk anything. But here's what happens sometimes. Ordinary people witness something so profoundly wrong that staying silent becomes impossible. Their conscience gives them no choice. On his 4th night at Ashwood, the night before he was scheduled to return to Charleston, Brooks couldn't sleep again. That same sound drifted through his window, clearer this time. Definitely human, definitely suffering. He lay in bed for an hour, trying to convince himself it was none of his business, that he'd misunderstood, that Whitmore's explanations were sufficient. But at 2 a.m, he got dressed, crept downstairs, and slipped out of the main house. The moon was 3/4 full, giving enough light to navigate by. He could see the causeway through the swamp, and at its end, lamplight in the hospital windows. Every instinct told him to go back, get on the morning coach to Charleston, forget everything he'd seen. Instead, he walked across that causeway, through water that reflected moonlight like broken glass, past cypress knees that jutted from the swamp like skeletal fingers, toward that light, that sound, that truth he didn't want but couldn't ignore. His hands shook. His breath came short and fast. But he kept walking. Now you have to understand, Brooks had no plan. He reached the hospital building and pressed himself against the outer wall, heart hammering so hard he was certain it would give him away. The sound he'd heard had stopped. Inside, there were voices. Whitmore's voice, calm and clinical. Physiological response indicates consciousness despite apparent catatonia. Interesting. Then another sound, gasping, choking. Someone trying desperately not to scream. Brooks found a window, one of the barred ones, and looked inside. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The room was lit by multiple lanterns. Medical instruments were laid out on a table with disturbing precision. And Whitmore stood over a young man, couldn't have been more than 18, who was restrained to a chair, head held immobile by a metal brace. Whitmore was doing something to the boy's throat. Brooks couldn't see exactly what, but the boy's eyes were rolling with terror and blood was running down his neck. Whitmore was taking notes between each incision, measuring responses, documenting everything like a scholar conducting research. The clinical detachment was somehow more horrifying than rage would have been. This wasn't anger or cruelty for its own sake. This was methodical, scientific. Whitmore truly believed he was advancing knowledge, that these weren't crimes but experiments, that these weren't people but specimens. Brooks stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. He had to get away. Had to, and then he heard it. Another sound from a different room. A female voice, broken and rasping, trying to form words. "Stop right here. I need you to understand something. What comes next is darker than anything we've covered so far." This is where the story crosses from historical horror into territory that will genuinely disturb you. If you're watching this late at night, alone, maybe turn on a light. If you're the kind of person who needs to step away from true crime content when it gets too real, this is your moment. But if you're still with me, if you're the kind of person who believes we have to face history's ugliest truths to prevent them from repeating, then let's continue together. Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where everything Brooks thought he understood about human nature gets shattered. Can you handle what comes next? Because there's no going back from here. Comment below if you're still with me, and let's find out what happened when that mute girl finally screamed. Brooks followed that sound. He moved along the outside of the building, peering through each barred window until he found her, Celia, in a small room, alone, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall. She was rocking slightly, and from her damaged throat came sounds that weren't quite words but weren't quite not words either. Broken syllables, fragments of language fighting their way through scar tissue and terror. She saw him at the window. Their eyes met, and something happened that Brooks would never be able to fully explain. She stood up, walked to the window, and pressed her hand against the bars. Not pleading, not begging, showing him. She pointed at her throat, then at the locked door behind her, then made a gesture, drawing her finger across her neck, then pointing in the direction where Whitmore was working. She was trying to tell him something, trying to communicate what had been done to her, what was being done to others. And then she opened her mouth wide and forced sound through ruined tissue. One word, more scream than speech, but unmistakable in the silent night. "Daughter!" The sound tore through her throat. Blood appeared at the corners of her mouth. But she said it again, louder, pointing at herself. "Daughter!" And Brooks understood. Celia wasn't just a victim. She was evidence. She was witness. She was testimony given voice. Everything happened fast after that scream. Lights appeared in the main building. Whitmore emerged from the hospital entrance, lantern raised, face twisted with rage. "Who's there?" His voice cut through the night, no longer refined or genteel. Raw, furious, desperate. Brooks ran. Back across the causeway, but Whitmore was faster than he looked, and he knew every inch of this property. Brooks heard him crashing through the undergrowth behind him, shouting for Pierce, for the overseer, for the slave catchers who lived in a cabin near the main road. I want you to picture this. A young man from Boston who's never run for his life, splashing through swamp water in near darkness, while behind him comes a man who has everything to lose if the truth gets out. Brooks's lungs burned. His legs tangled in something, vine or root, and he went down face first in brackish water. He could hear Whitmore getting closer. But then, voices from the slave quarters. People emerging, awakened by the commotion. Their presence changed everything. Whitmore couldn't chase Brooks openly with witnesses. Couldn't be seen desperately pursuing a white guest through the night without explanation. He stopped, composed himself, called out with forced casualness. "Mr. Brooks? Are you unwell?" I heard shouting. Brooks kept running. Reached the main road. started the 10-mile walk toward Charleston in complete darkness, knowing that if Whitmore caught him alone, he'd never reach the city alive. Brooks made it to Charleston at dawn, went directly to the federal marshal's office, and told his story to Deputy Marshal William Hayes. He told everything: the hospital, the experiments, Celia's scream, the young man restrained in the chair, the blood, the journals, all of it. Hayes listened politely, took notes, then said, "Mr. Brooks, Mr. Whitmore is a respected member of this community. These are serious accusations against a man of established character. Are you certain you understood what you were seeing? The management of slaves can sometimes appear harsh to northern sensibilities unfamiliar with our customs." This is where it gets truly chilling, because Hayes wasn't dismissing Brooks out of malice. He genuinely couldn't conceive of a Charleston gentleman conducting human experiments. The social order depended on men like Whitmore being trustworthy, moral, civilized. To accept Brooks's testimony would mean accepting that civilization itself was a lie, that respectability could mask monstrosity, that the entire foundation of Southern society might be rotten. "I'll make inquiries," Hayes finally said. "But I must advise you, sir, that making false accusations against property owners can have legal consequences. Perhaps you should return to Boston and let local authorities handle local matters." Brooks left the marshal's office understanding that official channels would do nothing. The system would protect Whitmore because the system needed men like Whitmore to be innocent. Truth was less important than order. But Brooks had one advantage. Northern newspapers didn't care about Charleston's social order. He went directly to the Charleston Courier's competitor, a smaller paper with abolitionist sympathies called the Southern Patriot, and told his story to editor Marcus Thornton. Thornton was a rare breed, a white Southerner who'd turned against slavery after years of watching its brutality. He saw immediately that this story could break something open. The article ran 3 days later. Horrors at Ashwood Plantation. Northern businessman reports medical atrocities. It spread to papers in Savannah, Richmond, even New York. Suddenly, the federal marshal couldn't ignore it. Neither could South Carolina authorities. A raid was organized not because they believed the accusations, but because public pressure demanded it. On March 15, 1854, Marshal Hayes arrived at Ashwood with 6 deputies and, crucially, 2 reporters. They found the hospital exactly where Brooks described it. They found the journals documenting years of experiments. They found restraints, medical instruments, chemicals, and in that locked room no one had ever entered, preserved specimens, human tissue in jars, detailed anatomical drawings, evidence of at least 17 enslaved people who'd been subjects of Whitmore's research. They found 3 people still alive in the hospital, so traumatized they couldn't speak coherently. And they found Celia locked in her small room, throat bleeding from the effort of that single screamed word. But they didn't find Whitmore. He'd vanished into the swamp the night the article published. The journals revealed everything. Cornelius Whitmore wasn't just a plantation owner. He was the educated son of a physician, trained in anatomy and physiology at the Medical College of South Carolina before his father's death forced him to abandon medicine for plantation management. But he'd never stopped thinking of himself as a scientist. He'd just changed his research subjects from cadavers to living human beings, whom the law designated as property. His journals showed a man utterly convinced of his own rationality. He wrote, "The peculiar institution provides unprecedented opportunity for advancing medical knowledge. These subjects, already bound to servitude, might at least contribute to science. Is this not more humane than allowing them to exist without higher purpose?" He'd rationalized torture as philanthropy, mutilation as research, years of systematic abuse as scholarly inquiry. Pierce, the overseer, broke under questioning. He admitted he'd known something terrible was happening, but had convinced himself it wasn't his responsibility to intervene. "I didn't do nothing to them people," he kept saying, as if passive witnessing wasn't complicity. His hidden notes, retrieved from under those floorboards, corroborated everything. 17 names. 17 people who'd been taken to the hospital and either died there or emerged fundamentally broken. And here's the darkest part. When investigators tracked down Whitmore's correspondence, they found letters to other planters discussing his methods. He hadn't been working alone. He'd been sharing his findings. The investigation expanded beyond Ashwood. Letters in Whitmore's desk revealed correspondence with at least 4 other plantation owners in South Carolina and Georgia. men who'd expressed interest in his techniques for managing difficult property. Two of them, Daniel Patterson outside Savannah and Edmund Keyes near Augusta, had built similar hospital facilities on their properties. Federal investigators raided Patterson's plantation in April 1854. They found 12 enslaved people in various states of physical and psychological trauma, locked in a building Patterson called his correction facility. They found equipment nearly identical to Whitmore's, journals documenting similar experiments, and, most damning, letters from Whitmore offering advice on proper methodology. Now, you have to understand, this wasn't just a few sadistic individuals. This was a network of educated, wealthy, respected men who'd convinced themselves that their legal ownership of human beings extended to using those people as experimental subjects. They cited medical precedent. Doctors had been conducting involuntary experiments on enslaved people for decades, testing surgical procedures, studying disease progression, developing treatments on black bodies before using them on white patients. But Whitmore and his correspondents had taken it further. They weren't treating disease. They were deliberately inflicting trauma to study its effects. They were attempting to develop techniques for perfect psychological control, methods for breaking human will so completely that rebellion became literally unthinkable. They were trying to turn slavery from a system of physical coercion into a system of mental imprisonment. Here's what happened next. And this might be the most disturbing part of the entire story. Charleston society closed ranks. Yes, Whitmore was gone. Yes, Patterson and Keyes were arrested. Yes, the physical evidence was undeniable. But the response from respectable white Southerners was immediate and coordinated. This was not representative. These were aberrations, bad apples, madmen who'd violated sacred trusts. The Charleston Mercury, the paper Whitmore had written letters to for years, published editorials distancing the planter class from his actions. The peculiar institution, properly conducted, is a benevolent system of labor management. What occurred at Ashwood was the work of a deranged individual and reflects in no way upon the character of our agricultural community. Churches held prayer meetings mourning not the victims but the tragedy of a respected family's fall from grace. Other planters quietly destroyed their own correspondence with Whitmore, burned letters, eliminated evidence. The Medical College of South Carolina issued a statement disavowing Whitmore's methods while carefully avoiding any examination of their own role in training doctors who routinely experimented on enslaved people. And when abolitionists in the North tried to use the Ashwood revelations as evidence of slavery's inherent evil, Southern politicians accused them of opportunism, of twisting a criminal aberration into political propaganda. Let's be real, the truth was too threatening to accept. Better to call Whitmore crazy than to examine what his sanity might reveal about the system itself. Cornelius Whitmore was never found. Some believed he'd drowned in the swamp during his flight. Others claimed he'd escaped to Texas or Mexico, disappeared into territories where questions weren't asked. His body was never recovered. His fate remains unknown. In some ways that's fitting. A man who'd erased so many people's identities, ending as a question mark himself. Daniel Patterson and Edmund Keyes were tried in federal court in 1855. Both were convicted of abuse of property and conduct unbecoming Christian gentlemen, not crimes against humanity, because their victims weren't legally human. Patterson received 2 years in prison. Keyes received 18 months. Both served less than a year before being quietly released. Both returned to plantation ownership under family names, their crimes effectively forgotten within a decade. Dalton Pierce, the overseer, was never charged. He testified against Whitmore, provided his hidden notes, and was considered a cooperative witness. He moved to Alabama and became an overseer there. Died of yellow fever in 1862, his complicity never legally acknowledged. Samuel Brooks returned to Boston and spent the rest of his life trying to make people care. He wrote articles, gave speeches, testified before anti-slavery societies. Most people found his stories too disturbing to believe, too extreme to be true. He died in 1889, largely forgotten, his courage dismissed as northern exaggeration, and Celia, she disappeared from records after 1854. The federal government freed the surviving victims from Ashwood as evidence in ongoing investigations, but freedom without resources, without family, without even full voice, meant vulnerability. Some historians believe she made it north. Others think she died unnamed and unmarked. one more casualty erased by history. The Ashwood revelations changed nothing systemically. Slavery continued for another 11 years until the Civil War ended it by force, not conscience. The medical establishment continued conducting experiments on enslaved and poor bodies well into the 20th century. The Tuskegee syphilis study, involuntary sterilizations, experimental surgeries without consent. The infrastructure of dehumanization that enabled Whitmore didn't disappear. It just evolved, found new justifications, new victims, new methods of making atrocity bureaucratic and therefore invisible. But here's what Celia's scream accomplished. It proved that silence can be broken. That even when every system is designed to erase your testimony, even when your voice has been literally destroyed, truth can still find a way through. She forced sound through tissue that shouldn't have been able to produce sound. She made herself heard when she'd been deliberately rendered mute. That single word, daughter, contained everything. Identity, history, witness, accusation. Now you have to understand the moral here isn't comfortable. It's not justice prevails or good triumphs over evil. The moral is darker and more necessary. Atrocity depends on silence. It requires the complicity of witnesses who choose not to see, authorities who choose not to investigate, communities that choose comfort over truth. Evil doesn't usually announce itself. It wears respectability like camouflage. It uses law and custom and social order as shields. The only thing that breaks it is people who refuse to stay silent. So here's my question for you. Could something like this happen today? Not plantation slavery. We like to think we've evolved past that. But the structure underneath it. Powerful people abusing vulnerable populations. Systems designed to protect respectability over truth. Communities that close ranks against uncomfortable revelations. Authorities that prioritize order over justice. Does any of that sound unfamiliar? Does any of that sound impossible in 2025? Let's be real. The details change, but the pattern repeats. Institutional abuse covered by bureaucracy. Victims dismissed because their testimony threatens powerful people. Whistleblowers punished while perpetrators walk free. We're not as far from 1854 as we'd like to believe. The question is, when you encounter injustice, when you witness something that everyone else is choosing to ignore, what do you do? Do you become Samuel Brooks, risking everything to tell the truth? Or do you become Dalton Pierce, keeping careful notes but never acting? Or do you become Charleston Society, protecting your comfort by dismissing evidence? Comment below. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? And more importantly, what injustice in your community is everyone choosing not to see? If this story disturbed you, good. It should. Subscribe for more investigations into the crimes history tried to bury. Hit the like button. Become a member for uncensored deep dives. Next week, the lighthouse keeper who locked his family in the basement for 7 years, and the Coast Guard inspector who heard them scratching at the walls. Until then, stay questioning, stay uncomfortable, and never ever assume respectability equals innocence.